We're good then. I'll just push it right now. Check 1, 2. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Midtown Scholar Bookstore. My name is Alex. I'm with the Scholar. Thank you for joining us this evening. We're happy you're here, and we hope you enjoy tonight's program. Before we begin, some quick housekeeping as always. I'd like to highlight one upcoming event on June 3rd with acclaimed housing expert Richard Rothstein, who is the best-selling author of The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. Here's the book. It's one of the best-selling books of all time at the bookstore. So he's coming out with a sequel, say. It's called Just Action, which describes how concerned citizens and community leaders can begin to undo housing segregation created by the government policies outlined in The Color of Law. So again, that's June 3rd at 6 p.m. and we hope to see you there. Lastly, I'd be remiss if I didn't make a shameless plug here. Some of you may have heard the Midtown Scholar was selected as Bookstore of the Year by Publishers Weekly. So just a huge thank you to our hardworking staff. And honestly, an award like this doesn't happen without a strong community of readers and writers. And so we're feeling especially thankful for everyone that shows up to these events, buys books, and gets something from our cafe. So thank you. But now I'm happy to introduce our speakers this evening. Drew Hart is a public theologian and professor of theology at Messiah University. He has 10 years of pastoral ministry experience and is the recipient of multiple awards for peacemaking. Hart attained his MDiv with an urban concentration from Mizio Seminary and his PhD in theology and ethics from Lutheran Theological Seminary at Philadelphia. He's the author of 2 books, Trouble I've Seen, Changing the Way the Church Views Racism, and Who Will Be a Witness, Igniting Activism for God's Justice, Love, and Deliverance. And we have both of those books for sale tonight, and they are signed up at the cafe. Of course, our featured author tonight is Jonathan Eig. Jonathan is a former senior writer for the Wall Street Journal. He's a New York Times bestselling author of several books, including Ali, A Life, Luckiest Man, The Life and Death of Lou Gehrig, and Opening Day, the story of Jackie Robinson's first season. Ken Burns calls him a master storyteller, and Eig's books have been listed among the best of the year by the Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, Sports Illustrated, and Slate. He lives in Chicago with his wife and children. Of course, the book that we are here for today is titled King, A Life. The New York Times has called it the new definitive biography of Martin Luther King Jr. And Dr. Peniel Joseph writes that, quote, with eloquence, compassion, and grace, Jonathan Eig offers a stirringly contemporary and complex portrait of a fully human and humane king whose contradictions, frailties, and shortcomings have worked in tandem with his brilliance, resilience, and genius to fundamentally transform American democracy and the world. We're honored to welcome Jonathan and Drew to Harrisburg. So without further ado, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Jonathan Eig and Drew Hart.
Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you. What a beautiful store this is. Thanks everybody for coming out.
Yep. Congrats again to Midtown Scholar for their award. That's pretty exciting. Jonathan, I guess to get started, I was recently in Minneapolis and I was with a friend who is a scholar himself who's working on a Vincent Harding biography. And when I told him that I was going to be interviewing you around a Martin Luther King biography, he was like, whoa, that's audacious, right? That was his response. That's audacious. And so I'm curious, like, why did you feel like you were well suited or had the guts to take on a book like this? What was it that made you feel like I'm going to take on a Martin Luther King biography?
It was really the opportunity was there and I couldn't resist. And I saw this gaping hole on the bookshelf and this terrible way that we had come to tell King's story in recent years, that we have flattened him, watered him down, turned him into a monument and national holiday honors he deserves. But in doing so, we've lost sight of so much of his humanity and his true radical nature.
Yeah.
So when I found myself during the Ali book interviewing Dick Gregory and Andrew Young and Harry Belafonte and asking them about the interactions between Ali and King, it just occurred to me, these guys knew King.
Yeah.
Like, holy cow. And if I didn't ask a follow-up question, like, what was Martin Luther King really like? I would be a fool. Like, how could I just not take that opportunity? So once I started just asking them really out of curiosity, not because I immediately thought I'm going to pivot to a King book, but just out of curiosity, I realized that there were dozens, maybe scores of people alive who still knew King, that I had to do this quickly if I was going to do it. I just tried not to think about it too much, because if I thought about it too much, it would seem audacious / stupid. So I just dove in.
Yeah. And it is, I mean, certainly timely. As I think about you giving an answer, like I, over the past 15 years, had the privilege of meeting so many folks who knew Dr. King, and so many of them are passing away or not with us. And there's these voices and these memories that are not going to be here forever. And so I think it's also timely just in terms of just taking advantage of all these folks who actually knew him intimately. Yeah.
Yeah, I felt like if I did nothing else, and I started before COVID, if I did nothing else but travel the country and meet and record Juanita Abernathy, Harry Belafonte, Dr. June Dobbs Butts, who grew up with King on Auburn Avenue, King's barber in Montgomery. If I did nothing else but that, and I just cataloged those, archived those recordings, I would have done a service. But then writing books is mostly the only thing I'm good at. So I figured I might as well do that too.
Ahead with it. Yeah, that's good. So then I'm curious, maybe it's kind of tied into that first question, but then like you've done all these interviews, you wrote this, like what do you see your book, like how do you see it, like what you've done, how is it set apart from some of the other King biographies that have been such a part of the landscape of our memory of Dr. King?
Well, if you go downstairs to the African-American history section and you look for a King biography, the main ones you're going to see are David Garrow's Bearing the Cross and the Taylor Branch trilogy. And those books are monumental. They're invaluable. And I couldn't have done what I did without them, but they're not exactly biographies. They're bigger than biographies. And I think, and I've talked to Taylor and Dave Garrow about this, and they don't consider their books biographies. They consider them American history books with a lot of King running through them. And I think in some ways, I wrote like the inverse of what they wrote. I wanted to write an intimate book. I wanted to make you feel his pain, and I wanted you to cry when we lose him at the end of the book. Sorry, spoiler alert there. But that was the main thing. I also felt like, as I said before, there was some correcting to be done in how his image has changed, especially since the creation of the national holiday, and many forces have appropriated his story in a way in attempting to using it for all different political sides of the equation. And I wanted to really remind people what he stood for and what he believed in, and remind you that he said things other than I have a dream.
Yeah, that's very important. So thinking about like, I mean, you mentioned even, interviewing Dr. King's barber, right? I mean, you really kind of did quite a bit of research, and there's also new sources that were available to you that weren't available to other folks previously. Can you talk some about some of these sources, what's new, and maybe like, what did you come across that might be lesser known stories of King that maybe, or interesting facts that you think might be interesting to others that you might want to share?
Oh, I could just go the next hour on that question, so don't let me go on too long. But I love interviews. I'm an old newspaper reporter, and I love going to people's homes and getting to know them and really spending enough time with them that they get comfortable with me and open up and remember things that they hadn't thought about before. And in the case of King, interviewing people who are in their 80s is actually beautiful because they don't care at all about anymore about hurting anybody's feelings. And they really opened up. But the other thing I love is detective work. I love trying to find things that Garrow and Taylor Branch missed. And in this case, people like Garrow and Branch and my friend Michael Long were coaching me, and Peniel Joseph, the other scholars who I reached out to, and I began by asking them if they would help. They coached me and said, have you thought about this looking here? Have you thought about looking there? For example, Coretta Scott King worked on her right after her husband was assassinated, began working on her memoir. And Garrow has transcripts of some of those interviews from that she did in writing the memoir, because she worked with a ghostwriter. So I said, where do you get those transcripts? And he said, University of Florida. I think that's where the ghostwriter's papers are collected. So I called the University of Florida. I said, what happened to the tapes? If there's transcripts, there must be tapes.
Yeah.
And they said, we have them. And they said, I said, they're not listed on your finding aid. No, they're not on the web. They said, well, that's because the King family said they wanted the tapes, and they threatened to sue us because they thought that was their property. But that was 20 years ago, and they haven't come to get the tapes. So they're still sitting here. We just don't advertise that we have them. And I said, can I come down there and listen to the tapes? He said, no, I just sent them to you by email. So that's how easy that was. But I wouldn't have had that. I wouldn't have found that without the help of Garrow and his notes. And another thing that I always do is I look at people who wrote early books or early magazine articles about my subjects. And in the case of King, as you know, I'm sure Lawrence Dunbar Reddick wrote the first biography of King. He wrote it right after the Montgomery bus boycott ended, and it's called The March to Freedom. Michael knows the name of it, but anyway, it's some Stride to Freedom. And I wondered, where are L.D. Reddick's papers? Where are his notes from that book? And it turned out that the Schomburg Library in Harlem had just received them, and they didn't just have the notes that he took when he wrote in that book. They had the notes of his entire career, and he stayed with King for 12 years. He is the only person who traveled to India with Martin and Coretta. Yeah. And he took notes on everything. And I was the first person to open those boxes at the Schomburg Library. So as you can tell, I get excited about this stuff. And I found so much new stuff. And that's one of the advantages of having a 25, 30-year gap between biographies, is that a lot of new stuff gets archived.
And I'm remembering, I think Daddy King had a biography, right?
Yeah, I found Daddy King's unpublished autobiography. Yeah. And that came about in just a weird way. I was working with a genealogist to try to track down the King's ancestry, because we don't know where or even when the Kings were enslaved. We don't know for sure that they were. We assume that they were, but they don't show up in the census until 1870. So in working with this genealogist, she said to me one day, have you seen this Martin Luther King Sr. autobiography? I found it referenced on a genealogy website. And I looked, and it had never been published. And the only place that had a copy, that said they had a copy, was the King Center in Atlanta, but they couldn't find it. And it took me about 2 years to figure out where I could find a copy. There are only 2 copies in the world, and one might be at the King Center, I don't know, and the other was at Stanford, and they didn't even know they had it until I told them to go look.
Wow. Yeah, I really appreciate, just the biographical information in the very beginning of the book, I thought was powerful and sets up really King's story really well. So I really appreciated that. So, I'm a theologian, so I'm very interested in matters around faith and how they intersect with people's lives, their lived theology, and especially for someone like King, how that shapes in his justice work. I'd be curious to hear, what were your insights on what you saw as related to King's faith and how it played out in terms of his story over the time that you're kind of researching his life?
This is going to sound stupid because his name is Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., but I was not prepared for just how deeply and profoundly his faith influenced everything he did. And maybe that's because I'm not a churchgoer. I am a fairly spiritual guy, but I wasn't prepared for just how much of his daily decision-making and how much of his political decision-making centered on his faith. And it shouldn't be a surprise. He's obviously raised in the church. His father and his maternal grandfather were preachers. He really learns to recite the passages from the Bible before he can read. He learns to be comfortable on stage by singing in the church choir, and he's traveling around to churches as a child, comparing the different preaching styles, most of which he prefers to his father's. And he's shaped in every way. And even when he has a brief moment in his life where he seems to try to escape from the church and tells his parents he wants to be a lawyer or a doctor, he comes back. He can't escape the gravitational pull of this force that's literally at the core of his being. But when it comes to his actions, that's where it gets the most profound for me, because he's called to lead the Montgomery bus boycott. He really doesn't want to do it. He just turned down an invitation actually just weeks earlier to join the local chapter of the NAACP because he was too busy. He has a new church and he's got a new baby, and he's not looking to take on any more responsibility. So he's certainly not looking to lead a bus boycott. But they ask him to take this on because he's new in town, really, and he hasn't made any enemies yet. And they think maybe people will unite behind him. This is something we were just talking about earlier, how difficult it is to unite the many factions from different churches, from different denominations, from different parts of town. Well, they pick King because nobody knows him yet, and he hasn't made too many enemies. He has a reputation for being a pretty good speaker. So he's not sure what to do. And before he gives that first speech, he has a panic attack. He's got 20 minutes to prepare for the biggest speech of his life, and he has a panic attack for 10 of those 20 minutes. And it's only when he just decides that God is calling him to do this and that he's just going to have to go there and speak and let God speak for him that he finds his voice. And over again throughout his career, when he's threatened, when his house is bombed, when he's stabbed in the chest, when the federal government is bearing down on him, and there are so many moments where he could have stepped back, where he didn't have to go to Chicago and challenge Northern racism. He didn't have to take on LBJ in the Vietnam War. It was the Bible. It was his religion that told him he had to, that you can't just pick and choose what you believe. You can't just pick and choose what you're going to fight for. You have to fight for all of it. And that just moved me. I'm still moved by it in ways that I really wasn't prepared for.
Yeah, and I think you did an excellent job of really depicting that and narrating how central that was for him, especially again during his clash, his prophetic witness against the Vietnam War. I think you really kind of just you pull back the curtain on, I think, what is really motivating him and why so many folks just didn't understand what was motivating him, right?
Yeah.
The frustrations that I think are happening because some people want to be so practical about these decisions, and he just felt like he had to go forward.
One of the really most heartbreaking moments for me in this book was right after the Beyond Vietnam speech, 1967, when he really summarizes all of his beliefs in this speech. One of his best friends and closest advisors, Stan Levison, calls him and says, "I didn't like that speech." And we know this, and we know exactly what King said because the FBI was taping the call, and we have a transcript of it. And we can talk later about, we'll get there. That, but King says, and Levison says, "It didn't sound like you. It's going to hurt our support in the North. It's going to destroy any chance of LBJ continuing to be an ally for us. And I think we should just stick to what we're good at." And King says, "Don't you know me? Haven't you been listening to anything I've said the last 10 years? It might have been politically wrong, but it wasn't morally wrong." And for him to have to explain that to one of his best friends, your heart just goes out to him. Yeah.
So there's a saying, I imagine you've heard this one before, but certainly I've heard people use it to talk about how we use Dr. King's image or expectations of Dr. King. There's a saying that I've heard that's Black people want a king with no flaws, and white people want a king with no claws, right?
I hadn't heard that one before.
Oh, you haven't? Okay, that's one I've heard.
I like that.
And I think, it's interesting to think about what you've done, because in some ways it's a very humanizing biography, right, of Dr. King, that understands the significance and the weight of who you are narrating, and at the same time, balances that with, being honest about his personal failures and his complexities, You want to say anything about your approach, how you were trying to navigate, taking on such a huge personality and really humanizing him in the midst of all these social expectations that people have around Dr. King?
Well, my operating principle was that this man is great enough for us to believe in him, to learn from him, to worship him, even if we know his flaws. We can still appreciate him. We can appreciate him more in a way because we're all flawed. We all fail to live up to our own ideals. And if we expect our leaders to be perfect, we won't have any leaders, and we won't have anybody willing to try to step up to take the next act, to live by the words that he offered us, by the words that the Bible offers us. No one's going to dare to lead if perfection is required. So I also felt like humanizing King would make him more relatable. I wanted to take him off of the mountaintop, off of the Mount Everest. He belongs on Mount Everest, but I don't want him there. I want him to be with us. I want us to feel what it was like for him. So yeah, I wasn't afraid of showing his flaws. I wasn't afraid to show that he suffered from depression, that he was hospitalized. He was, when he finds out that he won the Nobel Prize, he's in the hospital for what he calls exhaustion and for what Coretta calls depression. I mean, how profound is that? And he invites the reporters to come interview him in his hospital bed. So he wasn't afraid to show his weakness. And of course, there's the issue of his marital infidelity. There's no avoiding it. And I tried to put it in context. I certainly tried not to spend any more time on it than I had to, but I wanted to be honest. I wanted to let you know that he did have a long-term relationship with Dorothy Cotton, who was one of his closest aides, and that it was an important relationship to him. And he slept with other women who were not as important. We have to accept that, I think, to understand the full man. But what's most important about his sexual marital infidelities was that it became weaponized by the FBI. And I want to make sure that that is the big takeaway, that our government set out to use that to try to destroy one of our great moral leaders.
Yeah. And that was my take. I mean, I appreciated the honesty. I mean, I think that's one of the areas that many people are uncomfortable around Dr. King's life, is just being honest about the fact that for a very long time, right, he was engaged in these extramarital affairs. And we do have extra information from the FBI, right, because they are surveilling him, right? And so I appreciate the way that you are, I felt like walking a tightrope between being honest and chronicling that and kind of helping us see King and all his relationships and all his flaws, and at the same time, not allow us to lose sight of it is being weaponized, right? That these are efforts by the US government on a whole variety of levels trying to impede his civil rights activity. And I think that's essential.
Yeah, and there's a lot of new material that's come out in just the last couple of years about the details of his affairs. But what's important to me, the other thing that's come out is the details about the president's involvement in the surveillance. We now know, and this is another tip that I got from a scholar, from David Garrow again, who said, have you thought about checking LBJ's secretary's files? Because LBJ's secretary kept the most sensitive papers in her safe. And those papers had not yet been declassified. I was able to get many of them declassified. And what they showed was that J. Edgar Hoover was writing sometimes 2 or 3 times a week directly to the president with these really inconsequential, gossipy details about King's life. And not just when he was criticizing Vietnam, but when he was staying at a fancy hotel. And certainly when he was staying at a fancy hotel with another woman. And they seemed to really enjoy gossiping. I think a lot of it for LBJ was really that he liked having power. He liked having knowledge about not just his enemies, but his allies. And that I think he genuinely just seemed to enjoy the lascivious details of King's life too. And we tend to focus too much on, J. Edgar Hoover deserves all the criticism we can bring on him. And let's take his name off of the FBI headquarters, please. But let's not blame him alone. Let's remember that the president of the United States was encouraging this behavior. The news media knew about it and never reported on it. Members of Congress knew about it and did nothing. So it's not Hoover alone. There was an entire system and focused really on white Christian nationalism and maintaining that structure that was working also to damage King, not just King, but the entire civil rights movement.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things I also really appreciated about the biography is the really central and vital role that Coretta plays throughout. And I think probably better than anyone else, you've really just incorporated and demonstrate how essential she is to Dr. King, her activism before Dr. King, during and after Dr. You want to say a little more about what you were trying to do throughout the biography there?
Yeah, we do not yet have a really good Coretta Scott King biography, and I'm hoping someone will undertake that soon. And I have lots of notes and files that I'd be happy to share with whoever does that. If anyone's listening today, future biographers, even, But what I really wanted to do was show the reason King fell in love with Coretta was because she had more experience than him as an activist. Yes, she was beautiful and brilliant, but what really, and this is what Harry Belafonte told me too, that what really struck him was that this woman had already been fighting the battles that King hoped to someday fight. He had not yet been involved in any social action campaigns whatsoever. He was a student at Boston University. She was at the New England Conservatory, but she'd been to Antioch, where she had been involved in protests of a barber shop on campus that wouldn't cut black hair. She had been involved. She had petitioned the school to allow student teachers to work in black schools in the area. She had bona fides that he didn't have yet. And then, of course, the irony of that is that she had to basically shut it down when she got married, because he expected her to be a good, preacher's wife and to stay home and raise the kids. And she was very disgruntled about that and let it be known that she was not happy about it, but she was not able to move her husband much on that issue.
So I'm thinking about where we want to go in our last few minutes together in conversation before we open it up to others. I guess one of the things that I found interesting, which I don't know if maybe it was just a curveball to me as a reader, and maybe it wasn't intentional, but there was a moment at the very end of the book where I thought, because of your attention to the FBI and their surveillance of Dr. King, right at the ends, you kind of mentioned some of that again. So I thought that it was going to touch on or maybe resolve questions around conspiracy theories that are out there. But right as I thought like it was coming, it's like, nope, you're not giving that to us. So I'll be curious, like, did you come across anything at all that helped to bring clarity to any of those kind of questions, or there's just no answers to some of that stuff?
No, and lots of people have worked a lot harder than I have in looking at the conspiracy theories, and the family to this day, King's children, as well as Andrew Young and Reverend James Lawson, they still believe that there's something more at work here, that James Earl Ray did not act alone. But I found nothing, and I really tried not to open up any cans of worms. The point I want to make is that the FBI knowingly created the conditions in which someone might want to kill Dr. King. And even in the months before his death, they put out a memo, which I refer to as the Messiah memo, saying that Malcolm X is gone, Stokely Carmichael is not capable of uniting the country, Martin Luther King Jr. remains the most dangerous Black man in America, and he must be stopped. We must tell every bureau office around the country to do whatever they can to disrupt his movement, to undercut his reputation. This is a priority. So when you do that, the FBI knows what that means. They know what kind of message that sends. And I think that's more than enough of a smoking gun for me.
Yeah. So what do you hope, after readers finish up with your book, what do you hope that they take away from the book? What from his legacy do you think, especially given our current challenges in our society today, like what should we be taking away from King in this moment?
I want to ask you to answer that question next, but I'll take my best shot at it, then you can improve on my answer. It feels to me, and I know that feels to a lot of us and to a lot of my friends, that we're living in hopeless times, and that even the forces that King had at his disposal to help us protest, to help us fight for a better country are no longer available to us, right? 75% of Americans belonged to a church when King was alive, and 50% of Americans were in church on any given Sunday, and everybody read newspapers, and there was a sense of community that feels lost in this digital age when we're all sitting at home only looking at our friends' posts that reaffirm what we believe. There's a feeling that we can't do anything about our problems anymore, in part, I think, because we're more isolated than ever, and we grow cynical about that. And I think King's message is that we can't lose hope. We can't give up. We have to keep fighting no matter the obstacles. And nobody faced greater obstacles than King. Nobody had more pressure bearing down on him. So, what I hope people take away from this book is the sense that we have no choice but to keep fighting no matter how hard it may seem. So now I'm going to ask you to answer that question.
Yeah.
What message do you think, you've read the book, do you think you take away when it comes to activism?
Well, one of the things I heard King's own friend, Reverend C.T. Vivian, once say, he once said that the civil rights movement was a clash of two Christianities. And I think that is quite profound when we think about the life of King, because in seeing, again, this very humanized story of King, and yet seeing how his faith is driving and shaping so much of what he's doing, committed to those that are poor, committed to those that are struggling under segregation, committed to those who are in the ghettos, right? Committed to folks on the other side of the world, right? Who are being bombed by who he said US was the greatest purveyor of violence in the world, right? That it was his faith driving him. And so I think for me personally, one of the things that I enter into this book in is thinking about, like, what does it look like to participate in a liberating, justice-oriented faith that actually goes out into the public square and actually is committed to serving one's neighbors and making the world a little bit better of a place. And so that's my entry into this. But there's so much I think that we can take from Dr. King's story. And I think you write it in such a way that it's accessible for so many different readers to jump in and to take many nuggets away as they kind of reflect on his life. Thank you.
All right, we're going to transition to audience Q&A, but first, can we give a round of applause for Jonathan and Drew? So if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand right here.
In the prologue, you mentioned that King tried 2 half-hearted attempts at suicide when he was an adolescent. Could you discuss that? And also, was he ever involved in psychotherapy or counseling? And are there records of that?
Yeah, good question. So when King was a young teenager, he twice jumped from the second-story window of his home. Once when he and his brother were playing around and accidentally knocked over their grandmother, and he was so upset that he'd hurt his grandmother that he went up to the second story and jumped out a window. Was not seriously hurt. And then when his grandmother died not too long after, not related to the horseplay, he once again was so upset that he jumped out the same window. So he was clearly a very emotional person. As I said, he struggled with anxiety, with feelings of depression. And toward the end of his life, his friends were so concerned about him. And again, we can hear in these FBI transcripts that they were urging him to find a way to get out of the country, to leave, to go someplace where he wouldn't be bothered, just for, 6 months, for a year, anything. They were really deeply worried about him. And some of his friends did ask him to speak to a doctor, and the doctor did recommend that he consider medication for his depression, I think is how the doctor described it. But King wouldn't do it because he was afraid that if the FBI found out, they would leak that, and it would further damage his reputation.
Other questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm curious with your depth of research, what your process of writing was like, and how did you know, oh, this is the last piece I needed?
I'm still not done. I just had to turn it in. I spent the first pretty much year and a half, almost 2 years, not even thinking about writing because I had so much to learn, and also so many people to interview who were really old. And that was my priority. And I found over the years that if I start writing too soon, I'm wasting my time because I have to rewrite it because I'm not really qualified yet. So after a couple of years, I began to write and still continued researching, of course, all the way through and really up to the very end. Drew pointed out that and I didn't even think about this, that the big revelation the big news story that I had about the fabrication of Malcolm X's quote about King was not in the review copies of the book because I discovered it at the very end of my research, of my writing process. So the writing and research go hand in hand for me. And it's, for me, the writing is really just building blocks. It's taking all this research that I've assembled, tens of thousands of pages of and hours of interviews, and patching it, putting it together, building it together block by block, and it's really, really time consuming. When I talk to like my kids, and I said, how long do you think it would take you just to type this book? And try to put it in some context for them, how long it would take to write something like that when you have to have every fact at your fingertips, or at least in your file cabinet somewhere.
Hi, I am curious about one aspect of Dr. King's life. He seems like he never talked about class structure of the society and its relation to racism until he visits Chicago. And I mean, yes, he saw poverty in Chicago, but there is poverty in South too. So I don't know what was specific about Chicago visit. And also part of my question is if there is any effect on his assassination decision because he started talking about class and race.
I think you'll be surprised when you read the book to see how early King is actually talking about class. He's really, we're focused on racism in the South and on segregation because that's what the northern media likes to write about. But in fact, as he's raising money for the battles in Montgomery and Birmingham and Selma, he's traveling to the North to give speeches. That was the main way that he raised money. And King, when he went to those places, called out the racism and the classism in those towns in the North over and over again. The media didn't report on it because they were criticizing their own. They were criticizing those reporters. Those same reporters who were, moving out of the cities to the suburbs. The white reporters. It was a lot. The news media, the white northern news media in particular, wasn't ready for what King was saying about class and about northern racism. So when he moves to Chicago and brings it up, that's when part of the reason he's doing it is he's trying to force the northern media to address these issues that they've been conveniently ignoring for so long. And of course, it doesn't go well. And his advisors are telling him to just go back and focus on voting rights in the South. But he refuses. He refuses to compromise. And to answer the last part of your question, I absolutely think that his criticism of the Vietnam War diminished his popularity. You can see him falling sharply in Gallup polls when they ask you who are the most respected Americans. He's off the list by 66, 67. And it's absolutely turning up the heat from LBJ and from the FBI because they're irate that he's attacking the war, and LBJ is already feeling enormous strain because of the unpopularity of the war.
What were King's thoughts about his role, his fame in the civil rights movement, the weight of his role?
It's funny because Harry Belafonte talked about this too. He was not the kind of person who really loved being in the spotlight, even though he was so good at it. But he recognized that was an incredibly powerful opportunity. And he recognized it very early. Even in Montgomery, the white press comes down to cover the story and he becomes a star. And I don't think it would have worked the same way if Ralph Abernathy had been the leader of the movement, because King was just magnetic and he was so well educated and so telegenic that he just made for great drama. And here you have this unbelievably young, handsome, smart Black man who's basically talking circles around the sheriff and the mayor in all of these towns. And it just creates this great moral drama that the media loved. And King recognized that even when he didn't have a plan, like the freedom rides begin, the lunch counter sit-ins begin, protests erupt around the country, and they're asking him to come. He recognizes that he can be this great lightning rod, that when he drops in, everything explodes, more attention, more pressure on local officials. And he's willing to do that. He's willing to throw himself in. But he's not really comfortable with it. He doesn't really seek that kind of attention, that kind of fame. One of the fascinating things to me about King is that I think personally he didn't actually like conflict, which is a funny thing to say for one of our great protest leaders.
I've got to read just one quick question from a friend of the bookstore, Todd Allen. He just texted me. He said, of those closest to King, whom you were able to interview, who provided the most unique, interesting insight or perspective?
I'd have to go with, it's a close call between Harry Belafonte and June Dobbs Butts, who's someone you've never heard of. Dr. June Dobbs Butts was King's childhood friend. They played Monopoly together as little kids, and King's older brother would cheat, and ML, as she called him, would slap his brother's hand and would refuse to cheat even when his brother tried to slip him some extra money. But one of the things I loved about June, she went on to become a famous sex therapist, worked for Masters and Johnson, the first African-American woman to work at Masters and Johnson. And she did a summer internship with King where they traveled around Atlanta interviewing preachers. And she realized that King was embarrassed by his father, not just because his father was a country preacher and much more emotional, but because his father had a reputation for womanizing. And King told June over and over, I'm not going to be like that. I'm not going to be like that. And June just laughed, said, even at 15, 16, he was not monogamous. He was never monogamous a day in his life. And she said her heart went out to him because he wanted to do it. He wanted to be better than his dad. And I think that relationship between King Jr. and King Sr. is a fascinating one. There's a constant power struggle that goes on all of MLK's life. This push and pull with his father, wanting to impress him, but also wanting to go beyond him. And King always had a hard time managing that relationship.
This is a really good follow-up question to that. Could you talk a little bit about his relationship with his own children?
Yeah, unfortunately, he didn't have a lot of time at home. I mean, it was rare that he spent even like a whole week at home. We have his schedules, and oftentimes he'd be home for dinner and wouldn't even be able to stay after dinner was over. He'd have to rush out to another event, and he was traveling constantly, 250 days out of the year. So he was a loving father. The kids have really sweet memories of being with him when he's home. He loved to roll around on the floor and play ball in the backyard. He was really playful and affectionate, but he just wasn't home much.
Hi. You talked a little bit about the role his faith played. In what ways did you see him practice forgiveness?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. Never been asked that one before. Well, he talked a lot about loving his enemies, and he genuinely believed that people like Bull Connor and Sheriff Laurie Pritchett were capable of redemption and capable of learning, and he genuinely thought that he could extend a hand in friendship to them. And in some cases, I think some of those, I don't know if any of those famous antagonists came around. I'm gonna have to think about that and think about how he practiced forgiveness. Does anything occur to you as you read the book?
I mean, I don't know if it's anything. So, I mean, I think the more famous stories that everyone knows is like after his house is bombed in Montgomery, he's telling people not to respond with violence and stuff like that. I don't know if there's any new particular stories.
Well, I have an example, actually, now that I think about it. First of all, the woman who stabbed him in the chest, he spoke on her behalf and asked for her not to be jailed, and saying that she needed psychiatric help. And then in Birmingham once, he was there for an SCLC board meeting. And as he was speaking, a white man came up out of the crowd and punched him in the face. And he fell down, he collapsed. And Rosa Parks, who was there, ran across the street to get some ice. And Septima Clark, who was also there in the audience, swore that like King dropped his hands as he was punched, like never, like his instinct was not to respond. And then when the man was detained and held in the basement of the church where King was speaking, King went down and spoke to him and invited him to come back and listen to the rest of his speech. And when he got home, Coretta said, "That was stupid. What if he had a gun?" And King said, "I think he would have used it the first time."
Hi, Mr. Eig. I'm Todd. Thank you for coming today. I was thinking of those two examples you just said about the Miss Curry who stabbed him and the American Nazi who showed up in Birmingham. But I wanted to ask you about Stokely Carmichael, because I could imagine doing a book like this, not only you're learning about King, but you're learning about all these other people. And the common perception is that the two butted heads all the time. And my understanding is that it's not the case. And in fact, Stokely Carmichael had great admiration for King and vice versa. And so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, one of the things I loved about King is that he really engaged with the people who disagreed with him. And Stokely, as they were marching through Mississippi in 1966, Stokely was trying to convince King to embrace Black power, and King said, "I'm not going to use those words." And Stokely said, "Oh, I'm going to push you until you do." And anyway, I'm still getting something out of it just by me using Black power, and you refusing to use it makes me look more of a badass. So King said, "That's all right. I've been used like that before." And but you do see Stokely's influence on King. He doesn't quite say Black power, but he starts talking about the power of Black people a lot more. It's infiltrating his thoughts and ideas. And the same goes for Malcolm X. Malcolm X intentionally set out to use King as a foil, to call him an Uncle Tom so that he would appear bolder and more dangerous. And in fact, when Malcolm X was in Tuskegee speaking and heard that King was in Selma, he drove across to Selma and found that King was in jail, couldn't speak to him, but said to Coretta, "Just tell Dr. King that I know what I'm doing and that maybe people will be more likely to deal with him when they realize I'm the alternative." So I think King was really open-minded to those people who had different views. And I mentioned earlier the revelation that Alex Haley's quote of King was fraudulent. It was made up. This is those of you who haven't heard, Playboy magazine printed the longest interview ever done with King. And in this interview, they wrote, King was asked, "What do you think of Malcolm X?" And he says, I think his fiery oratory is dangerous. And that's not at all what King said. Alex Haley changed the quote. What King actually said was, "I don't think I have all the answers. And while I disagree with Malcolm's calls for violence, I think we share a lot of the same ideas, essentially." So once again, just proof that King was a good listener.
This is so riveting and captivating. Can you talk a little bit about King's athletic prowess, or maybe just King in sports in general? I often think of him as bookish, but there's this other playful side to him, isn't there?
Mike Long has some special interest in this because he and I have both written Jackie Robinson books, and the interactions between King and Jackie Robinson are also really interesting, as you know. But as an athlete himself, King was very active as a kid, loved to play football and basketball in the backyard, played a little bit of basketball at Morehouse and at Crozier. There's actually a box score in the newspaper in Pennsylvania from when King played a couple of games with the Crozier team. He was not great, and a couple of people I talked to who played with him said that he shot the ball too much, which is probably in character, I think. But he was 5'7" and my height exactly, and I like the thought of him just being a scrappy, even if he does shoot a little too much. And his main source of recreation, he played a little tennis, but his main source of recreation and exercise was swimming. He liked to go to the Y and swim every chance he could get.
thank you for all of this, but your book doesn't really talk at all about his Jewish relationships. His work with Heschel was not just a professional one. His work with Joachim Prince isn't mentioned at all in the book. And there's been and I hate to use the term whitewashing, but in the movie Selma, there is no Abraham Joshua Heschel going across the Pettus Bridge. And you don't address in the book, or at least I haven't seen it in cursorily looking through, his Jewish relationships or the impact that those have had on his justice movement.
Yeah, I do wonder if I downplayed it a little bit. I did talk to several of the rabbis who marched with King, and I did include a little bit of their testimony, and I certainly mentioned the importance of his relationship with Heschel, but I don't get into it that much. And given that I'm Jewish, maybe that was a really silly mistake for me to make. But I also had to make a lot of choices because I wanted this book to be readable and fairly concise, even though I know it feels like it's heavy and you're gonna have to, use it for a doorstop when you're done reading it. But I really just had to leave some things out, and I felt like so many faith leaders responded to King's call, and the Jewish faith leaders were absolutely courageous and extraordinarily helpful. But I didn't want, I guess I didn't want to overdo it, and maybe I erred on the side of caution. We'll see.
Just a quick question from YouTube that I'll ask, and then we'll go to you. Someone just says they hope you touch on the tapes of King that are scheduled to be released in 2027. Do you have any comment about that?
Yeah, so we have transcripts of King's phone calls that the FBI was recording, and the people who have listened to those transcripts, who are on those transcripts, people like Andrew Young, Bayard Rustin, when he was still alive, said that the transcripts are accurate, but we still don't have the tapes. And they're scheduled to be released in 2027. So we will see just how accurate the transcripts are. We'll see what else is on those tapes that we don't know. And there's one particularly troubling allegation made in a marginal note in one FBI memo, and that King may have been in the room during a rape, and that's been reported by others in the past. And we will find out when those tapes are released whether there's any validity to that accusation.
What extent did Coretta know about his infidelities, and did she ever confront him about them?
Not as far as we know. Coretta wrote in her books many times that she believed her husband was faithful, and there's nothing on the tapes that would reveal that they ever had a confrontation on the issue.
We have time for just one more question, so it'll be, or two more questions here and then there.
Mr. Eig, thank you for your time tonight. If there's something besides I Have a Dream that the average student knows, it would probably be the letter from the Birmingham jail. And you say two interesting things about it in the book. First of all, you say that, I think they're your words, that you characterize it as redefining religious leadership. And then you also call it a love letter. Could you comment on both of those characterizations?
Well, I think by redefining religious leadership, King was always deeply troubled by religious leaders who were satisfied with the status quo, who were willing to say, slow down and wait. That's really the main theme of the letter from Birmingham jail. He was responding to religious leaders who said, we're on your side. We just think you should stop pushing so hard. Give us some time. And King's response was that the Bible doesn't tell us to be patient in trying to follow God's, try to live up to God's image and trying to create a better world. The time is always right to do what's right. And in that way, I think he was redefining religious leadership as a call to action, the call to action now. And as a love letter, it's a love letter to God. It's a love letter to community. It's a love letter to our fellow man, saying, we can do this together if we just, care about each other. I think that's what I was saying.
So be our last question.
Hi, thank you very much. I appreciated what you said about King's faith commitments and his relationship to his theological vision and to God being at the center of his being, and that motivating him so powerfully. And one of the things that is unique, maybe not unique about King, but important about King is that he emphasized love so much. And he talked about love not just as a feeling or a nice idea, but as something like an actual social force or a cosmic force, like soul force, like Gandhi did.
Right.
And I wonder if there's anything that you could say to readers of the book nowadays about that idea of love that would be relevant to us now.
Oh, I think that we tend to think that calling for love is naive these days. We're all a little cynical, but love is the core of what the Bible teaches. It's essential to everything, as I said before, that, King drew all of his philosophy, all of his activism, all of his work on the Bible. And I think, I'm not a theologian, we have one here, but I think that love is the core force behind every religion. And I think that's what King was trying to remind us, that it's not naive and it's not pie in the sky idealism, it's real, and that it has power.
Can we give one more round of applause for Jonathan and Drew? Congratulations, Jonathan, on the book. Thank you, Drew. We're going to have a book signing now. So over at this table, Jonathan's happy to sign your book, personalize it to whomever. We have books available for purchase up at the cafe if you'd like to get a copy. And we also have Drew's 2 books, Trouble I've Seen and Who Will Be a Witness. They're already signed, but